Boston Public Library Sargent Lecture Series, Sourcing the Madonna of Sorrows, Painting, Sculpture, and Sargent Spanish Photographs, with our accomplished guest speaker this morning, if you're joining us from Boston, and this afternoon, if you're joining us from Europe, Chloe Sharpe, who today is here virtually from Madrid, Spain. My opening remarks will be relatively brief today because we are honored to be joined by art historian and Sargent scholar Richard Ormond, who is calling in from London. So we are truly a multinational Zoom session. And Richard will gratefully formally introduce Chloe. Richard has undertaken the momentous task with co-author Elaine Kilmurray of cataloging the work of John Singer Sargent. The artist's output includes some 900 oil paintings and more than 2,000 watercolors, alongside thousands of drawings distributed across individuals and institutions. And each of these are worthy of study and research. Needless to say, Richard, it is no small feat. Richard and Elaine released the first volume of the series in 1998, the most recent volume, number 9, in 2016, and a catalog on Sargent's charcoals adjacent to a remarkable exhibition at the Morgan Library in New York in 2019. The series, of course, and I was just commenting, is available to all for loan and access at our very own Boston Public Library. In addition to being one of the central and preeminent scholars in the world on the artist, Richard also holds personal ties, as he is Sargent's great nephew. I will turn it over to you, Richard, for introductory remarks to Chloe's talk, but I do want to express my sincere gratitude to you for your unparalleled contributions to the study of and frankly, the access to the work and life of John Singer Sargent, and for your generosity to so many individuals and institutions like ours who have joined in on this effort. Richard, we are endlessly grateful to you for your support and encouragement of this series and our ongoing work to interpret, and in some cases reinterpret, the world of Sargent at Boston Public Library. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Meg, for that nice introduction. It's a great pleasure to introduce Chloe Sharpe today. She'll be showcasing the new sources of inspiration for the imagery in Sargent's murals at the Boston Public Library. And it really goes back to the discovery of some 800, I may have got that number not quite right, of photographs belonging to Sargent, who collected these in his travels across Europe, of buildings and sculpture and other things that caught his attention. And he made use of these in the murals, as Chloe will explain to us. They were given to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London in 1926, and then virtually disappeared. There was a distinction between documentary photographs, which were given out to the departments, and fine art photographs. And so these were distributed to the departments when the whole point about them was that they had belonged to Sargent and represented a kind of visual index to the things that interested him. So it was thanks to a young V&A curator who was exploring these documentary photographs, Elia Ravilius, that she came across one or two of these, and which went back to the master record, and lo and behold, she discovered this large number. So now they're bringing them all back together, and Chloe is the first person who's really exploited this rich archive to demonstrate the things that were catching Sargent's imagination as he traveled about. They are a visual index to his taste and knowledge of works of art. He was, of course, steeped in the old masters and had been from boyhood. Anyway, I think that's enough. Chloe will tell us more about all that. Chloe holds a PhD in the history of art from the University of York, with a thesis on 19th and early 20th century Spanish funerary sculpture. And it's really, Chloe has really been exploring a lot of the photographs of Spanish subjects, and she's really been exploring this and relating them to the murals because Sargent was using lots of Spanish motifs in his imagery for the murals. She's currently a lecturer in art history at ESNI University, the College of Design, Technology and Innovation in Madrid, and she's going to be talking to us from Madrid. And she previously taught in other universities. She's also worked as a museum educator in Spain and in the United Kingdom. And she was a fellow of the sculpture department in the Prado Museum in Madrid from 29 to 11. So she's very experienced curator and researcher, and I think we're going to have quite a revealing talk today. So Chloe, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Richard, for your kind introduction, and Meg for inviting me to participate in this fantastic lecture series. Let me just share my screen with you. So just a second. Okay. Okay, hopefully that's looking good. Okay, so in 1890, soon after receiving the commission from the Boston Public Library trustees to paint a series of murals on a subject of his choice, John Singer Sargent wrote excitedly to his friend Ralph Curtis. "This Boston thing," the letter says, "will be, entre nous, medieval, Spanish and religious, and in my most belly-achy mood. What a surprise to the community." As we know, this initial intention developed into a broad and complex scheme that encompassed various religions, historical periods, and artistic styles. More specifically, Sally Promey has demonstrated in her book, Painting Religion in Public, that in the final project, Sargent's aim was to show the supposed progression of Western religion from institutionalized and ritualistic forms of belief towards greater spirituality and individualism. However, the Spanishness that Sargent had originally intended was not lost. Viewed as a whole, the completed murals conjure up a general sense of the material richness reminiscent of Spanish Baroque art. Moreover, many of the Catholic-themed panels were directly influenced by sculpture and painting in Spanish churches and museums, as Mary Crawford Volk has explored in some of her publications. Sargent's artistic engagement with Spain ran deep and is in fact the subject of a forthcoming exhibition, Sargent in Spain, which Richard Ormond is curating alongside Elaine Kilmurray and Sarah Cash, and it's due to open in Washington this October. As part of today's talk, I'll discuss some of the material that will appear in the part of the exhibition dedicated to religion, but I'll be focusing my attention particularly on the library panel that is most obviously and explicitly Spanish, the Madonna of Sorrows, otherwise known as Our Lady of Sorrows, which was installed in 1916. The work represents the culmination of over 20 years of Sargent's fascination with and research into Spanish Marian iconography. As we shall see, he drew on a huge array of literary and sculptural sources, relying heavily on photographs of religious statuary that he collected on his numerous trips to Spain. These constitute a significant subset of the 611 photographs that once belonged to Sargent, recently rediscovered, as Richard just told us, at the Victoria and Albert Museum by curator Ella Revilius. And here I show you only a very small selection from the approximately 80 photographs of Spanish art and architecture in the Sargent photographic collection. Following a roughly chronological order, I'll be exploring the significance of the photographs and other sources for interpreting the Madonna of Sorrows. I will also discuss how Sargent consistently conceived the figure as one of a visual and conceptual pair, or rather as one of several pairs, as he paired her with Christ, Astarte, and the handmaid of the Lord in the mural scheme. And in the next slide, I've borrowed a floor plan from a virtual gallery of Sargent's work, just so you can see the location of the Madonna of Sorrows in relation to the comparative works I'll be referring to, along with the dates when each was installed. So the Madonna marked in blue is part of the Catholic-themed south end of the hall. It appears just below the Mysteries of the Rosary, which stretches across the vault. Opposite the Madonna, there's a second representation of Mary, titled The Handmaid of the Lord. And at 90 degrees at the end of the hall is the Dogma of the Redemption with its sculpture of the crucified Christ in the center. All these are marked in red. In yellow, diagonally opposite the Madonna is Astarte, one of the panels representing pagan religions and one of the first to be installed. And finally, in green is Church, part of the final installment of 1919. The roots of the Madonna of Sorrows go back as far as the year 1879, when Sargent made his first trip to Spain as an adult. It was on this decisive visit that he first copied the paintings of Velázquez at the Prado Museum and created the sketches of Roma culture and dance in Seville, which became the basis for his major exhibition success, El Jaleo. Yet he also found time to visit masterpieces of religious architecture and stepped off the beaten track to paint two as yet unidentified devotional sculptures of a crucified Christ and a Spanish Madonna. This attention to Spain's religious side was not altogether surprising, since visitors consistently presented the country as innately and archaically Catholic. For instance, travel writer Richard Ford, author of the very popular Handbook for Travelers in Spain, which Sargent almost certainly used on some of his trips to the country, Ford noted, and I quote, "Religion pervades every part and parcel of Spain and the Spaniard." At the same time, this religiosity was seen as a dark force, as the origin of the superstition, corruption, and obsession with death and violence that supposedly characterized the country. Spain's devotional sculpture, with its Baroque polychrome representations of the bloody corpse of Christ and of the richly dressed Virgin Mary in mourning, became a key element in the stereotype. Added to this was the fact that Protestant outsiders had long associated statues of the Virgin in particular with idolatry. In this vein, another 19th century traveller to Spain, Henry Inglis, recounted in his book various anecdotes about devotees venerating statues, supposedly unable to distinguish between Mary and her representation. If we go back to Sargent's 1879 oil sketch of a Spanish Madonna, we can see the first echoes of these cultural attitudes. In contrast with the crucifixion study, which obviously shows a sculpture, the figure of Mary is ambiguous, falling somewhere between sculptural object and person. She's also forward-facing and almost symmetrical, compared with the crucified Christ figure. And this is something we're going to see again and again in Sargent's work. Her head is framed by an enormous floating metal halo, and her expressionless face and thin hands appear both delicate and slightly sinister. The strangeness of the image was accentuated in Sargent's stylized reworking of it that he produced to illustrate Alma Strettel's book of Spanish and Italian folk songs, published in 1887. As we can see here, the image was placed next to a love song in which the male voice says, and I quote, "Come home with me, sweetheart, and I will tell my mother that Our Lady of Grace thou art." It was perhaps this association of the Virgin Mary with a lover that led a contemporary reviewer to connect Sargent's illustration with Charles Baudelaire's subversive poem To a Madonna, which appears in the volume The Flowers of Evil. In the poem, the jealous narrator imagines his mistress as a Spanish statue of the Virgin, into whose heart he plunges 7 knives. Whether Sargent himself had Baudelaire in mind when he provided the illustration is hard to know, but we do know that he had discussed Baudelaire with Vernon Lee and other friends not long before. As we shall see, the idea of subverting the purity of Mary is something that becomes relevant again later, in the Boston Public Library's Madonna of Sorrows. Sargent's daring portrait of Isabella Stewart Gardner, completed the following year, shows his continued visual attraction to Catholic icons of the Virgin, although in this case without any of the subversive connotations. Here he repeated the format of the Spanish Madonna, but positioned the sitter against a textile backdrop to suggest a Marian crown and halo. It was 2 years later, in 1890, that Sargent accepted the Boston Public Library Commission and stated his ambition to make it medieval, Spanish, and religious, as we have seen. A letter reveals that he intended to begin the mural research by experiencing Seville in the spring of 1891, during Holy Week, which is the week preceding Easter Sunday. Spanish Holy Week processions fascinated foreign visitors to Spain, and Seville was especially famous for the atmosphere and pomp of its spectacular processions. In this 19th century painting by French artist Alfred Dourdan, we can appreciate the main elements of such processions. Penitent members of confraternities process through the streets, carrying and accompanying mounted, sumptuously dressed religious sculptures known as bassos, to solemn musical accompaniment. This multi-sensory religious ritual has changed little since the 16th century. And here I show you some much more recent images. While Sargent did not make the Seville trip in the end, his intentions are significant, since the principal protagonists of the Holy Week bassos were the Madonna of Sorrows and the Crucified Christ, and both of these would become key characters in the completed Boston Public Library mural scheme. Sargent made it to Spain the following year, in 1892, primarily for a family get-together. However, he did add some artistic sightseeing to the end of the trip, visiting the city of Burgos, which is almost certainly when he bought these commercial photographs of 2 Gothic altarpieces, both of which he also expressed admiration for in correspondence. These may have been the first Spanish photographs acquired specifically for the Boston mural project, as we will see in a few minutes. Sargent's interest in Spanish statues of the Virgin resurfaced in 1895. That year, he travelled to Boston to install the first completed mural panels, mostly representations of pre-Christian religious figures inspired by Assyrian and Egyptian art. Among these was an image of Astarte, who was intended to represent primitive and polytheistic forms of belief in the mural scheme, and whom Sargent described as a soulless goddess of sensuality in his description of the mural panels. What's particularly interesting here is how Sargent adapted previous visual and literary representations of Astarte in order to accentuate iconographical links that he had identified with the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception. The Immaculate Conception was an advocation of Mary that was particularly popular in Spain, and whose cult had long been championed by the Spanish monarchy, to the extent that she was practically a national symbol. And I show you here a famous representation of the type by the Spanish Baroque painter Bartolomé Murillo. Astarte and the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception shared the moon as a key attribute. However, in Astarte's case, it was usually positioned near her head, as it was in Dante Gabriel Rossetti's painting Astarte Syriaca and the associated poem, which Sargent owned a copy of. It was in a book in his library. So Sargent was drawing a clear parallel here with the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception by instead standing his Astarte on a crescent moon, placing the sun behind her head like a halo and dressing her in celestial blue. He also placed her on a plinth to emphasize that she was an idol. And it's worth noting that Sargent owned at least 2 devotional reliefs of Mary on a crescent moon, probably purchased in Spain. And I'm showing you one of those here. So when he installed Astarte in 1895, we can conclude that Sargent was setting up a visual pairing between the goddess and the representation of the Madonna of Sorrows that he had in mind for another of the mural panels. Indeed, it was just after installing Astarte that Sargent travelled back to Spain to research the Madonna of Sorrows in earnest. Two travelling companions on that 1895 trip philosopher George Santayana and Dr. William White left written records of Sargent's intentions. Santayana's memoirs recalled, and I quote, "Sargent wished to re-examine the dressed wooden images of the Mater Dolorosa in view of a Madonna that he meant to introduce into his design. His appreciation of these so Spanish images appealed to me. He had altogether outgrown Protestant shyness in religious art and felt the deep passion in it. As for William White, he kept a detailed journal on the trip and recorded details of the conversations he shared with Sargent. Discussing sculptures of the Madonna, he wrote, and I quote again, Sargent's plan for the decoration of the Boston Library seems to involve a consideration of early idolatry, then of the symbols of primitive Christianity, and then of the relapse into idolatry indicated by these images, i.e. the Spanish Madonnas. The contrast between these two accounts is revealing. Santayana clearly admired Sargent's unconventional enthusiasm for the Catholic subject matter, especially given that the painter was from a Protestant background. Yet White's account makes it clear that Sargent associated Spanish Madonnas with a primitive idolatry, the kind of idolatry that Astarte also represented. These accounts taken together hint that Sargent had a dual approach to Spanish religious sculpture, whereby material and aesthetic delight went hand in hand with a sort of moral censure, or at least distaste. And this is something that is borne out in the Boston Library murals, as we will see. On this 1895 trip, Sargent focused his Madonna research on Granada. He visited many religious buildings there and stayed on after his travelling companions had departed, because, according to White's diary, he was not done with his Madonnas yet and had many in Granada to copy. Unfortunately, only one such copy has been confidently identified, and it's not actually a Mater Dolorosa, or Madonna of Sorrows, which is a representation of Mary in mourning at the death of her only son. Instead, it's the atmospheric oil sketch that you can see here, which vividly captures the gleaming gold and silver sculpture of Our Lady of the Rosary in its sumptuous Baroque setting. Thankfully, we can gain a fuller picture of Sargent's Madonna research thanks to the rediscovery of the Spanish photographs in the V&A. As Richard was telling us in the introduction, the photographs were donated to the museum by the artist's sisters soon after his death in 1925. Sargent had apparently not pasted them into albums as he often did, but left them loose. And this meant that the museum accepted the donation as a useful documentary research, but immediately separated the photographs geographically and thematically according to their content. The Sargent connection was effectively lost until archival work by Ella Revilius re-established this link. Now, by bringing the prints back together, the extent of Sargent's fascination with sculptures of the Virgin and with Spanish religious sculpture and architecture in general becomes clear. For instance, the photographic collection includes these two images of a sculpture that Sargent must have seen on the 1895 Granada trip, the patroness of the city, Our Lady of Anguish, which is an alternative name really for a Madonna of Sorrows. Both prints were clearly taken by commercial photographers, but they capture different moments, since Christ is veiled in one print and unveiled in the other. In the unveiled version, we can see that poles have been fixed to the base in preparation for procession through the city streets. And I'm showing you in the next slide a recent photograph of such a procession, which in this case takes place each September. Interestingly, based on a letter from his sister Emily, it seems highly likely that Sargent actually witnessed this particular procession on a later visit to Granada in 1912. Meanwhile, Sargent's attraction to what we could call the gory naturalism of Spanish religious art is also reflected in the prints that he bought of a sculpture showing the severed head of St. John the Baptist, which was on show in Granada Cathedral. The sculpture is now believed to be Neapolitan, but at the time it was attributed to the Spanish Baroque sculptor Alonso Cano. There's no definitive proof that Sargent went to Seville after Granada, though he apparently intended to do so. He certainly acquired a large number of photographs of Seville's processional sculptures, perhaps trying to make up for the fact that he had missed out on experiencing the Easter week processions themselves on his aborted trip 4 years earlier. The folkloric or popular aspect that interested most foreign visitors is mostly absent or anecdotal in these photographs. We do occasionally catch a few glimpses of the people involved in the processions, the bearers and the penitents, but by and large, the photographs show the sculptures of Mary as icons for veneration, rather than as part of a cultural experience. Particularly since the figures mostly face directly forwards and are often placed against blacked out backgrounds that effectively erase the context. Sargent did not make use of his Marian research immediately. In fact, a sculptured Christ rather than a Spanish Madonna was the centerpiece of his first Catholic-themed mural, Dogma of the Redemption, installed in the Boston Public Library in 1903. Sargent was evidently struck by the church-like nature of the hall space, with its long barrel vault as in a church nave. Thus, at one of the ends, he decided on this highly symmetrical lunette design featuring a dazzling relief sculpture of a crucified Christ with Adam and Eve. Mary Crawford Volk has argued that Christ's abundant blood flow and the naturalistic details of his twisted feet recalled Spanish sculpture, and has cited the Miraflores altarpiece in Burgos as a possible iconographical source. The fact that Sargent owned a photograph of this altarpiece gives yet more weight to this suggestion. Another photograph that may have inspired him captured a second processional image, this time of a deposition, in which a looping band of cloth binds the crucified Christ to the sculpted figures that accompany him. In a similar way that Sargent joined Adam and Eve to Christ with this long red cloth symbolic of blood in his own rendition. Now, in the mural scheme, Dogma of the Redemption was meant to represent Catholicism as an authoritarian and ritualistic form of Christianity. Yet the representation of Christ's suffering and quiet dignity has, I suggest, an emotional appeal that is missing from the rigid depiction of the Trinity immediately above, perhaps implying that this human Christ was above denominational distinctions. This message fitted with the writings of Ernest Renan, which Sally Promey has shown influenced the entire mural scheme. And it probably chimed with Sargent's own religious stance too. For Promey has argued that Sargent was not deeply religious, but did believe in a universalized God and an idealized and very human Jesus. There's no doubt that the painter was deeply attached to the crucifixion relief, as he produced numerous bronze versions, giving some away to his friends. And one of them was even selected by his sisters for the Sargent Memorial in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Having installed the Dogma of the Redemption, Sargent went immediately back to Spain, spending the summer of 1903 touring the centre and northwest of the country. Still deeply intrigued by the role of sculpture in the Catholic spiritual experience, he made this very unusual watercolour of the Spanish saint Teresa of Avila. The work is far from a conventional depiction of the saint having a vision, and I'm thinking of Bernini's famous sculpture here. Instead, it seems to represent a mystical experience prompted by a statue of her. The statue corresponds to a work attributed to Gregorio Fernandez and located in the Saint's Church in Avila. But the watercolour is clearly not a study. Sargent extended the halo into an enormous circle of golden rays, thereby adding a supernatural dimension, as though the inanimate object has somehow transformed into the saint. This blurring of the distinction between person and sculpture recalls his treatment of the 1879 Spanish Madonna and anticipates what he would do with the Madonna of Sorrows in the Boston Library panel. While on this trip, the progression of the mural project must have made Sargent particularly attentive to church architecture and interior decoration, which he repeated in various drawings and watercolours. He also seems to have bought several photographs, including a representation of the Romanesque chapel of St. Catherine in Lyon, a chapel whose semicircular arches decorated on the underside with bands of small paintings, prefigures the mysteries of the Rosary that Sargent would later create in Boston. He also continued his research for the Madonna of Sorrows by acquiring this photograph of a very particular type of Mater Dolorosa, one in which each of Mary's 7 sorrows are represented by a sword or dagger piercing her heart. And we will remember that this is, of course, the type of Virgin Mary that Baudelaire had subverted in his poem to a Madonna. Here I show it to you alongside a much more recent image of the same sculpture in procession. It was probably around 1908 that Sargent set about creating the definitive Madonna of Sorrows that he'd been planning since the early days of the mural project. It was certainly completed by June 1912, when it was exhibited in London, as Karen Corsano and Daniel Williman have demonstrated, although it was not installed in Boston until 1916. In the panel, Mary is shown crowned and sumptuously dressed in black and gold, standing on a crescent moon, which rests on a low gold pedestal. She stares straight ahead with an impassive expression, as she clasps to her chest 7 metal swords that project in relief from the canvas. 2 symmetrical tiers of candles, also rendered in relief, form a sort of screen in front of her. The work conflates 2 traditional Catholic manifestations of Mary. On the one hand, the Immaculate Conception with the upturned moon, and on the other, the Virgin of the 7 Sorrows with the 7 swords. Moreover, the candle arrangement clearly imitates the theatrical presentation of such sculptures for procession in the streets during Holy Week. And we've already seen that Sargent had multiple examples of each of these visual elements in the photographs he collected in Spain. Another photograph we've not yet commented on shows the Virgin of the Tabernacle in Toledo. And Sargent's manner of doubly framing the Virgin's head in gold, firstly with a circular halo on the canvas itself, and secondly by exploiting the architectural framing of the space, is reminiscent of this image, as well as resembling, of course, his own Spanish Madonna of 1879. What's more, the hieratic air of Sargent's Madonna of Sorrows is already present in many of these photographs. These accentuate the often stiff and symmetrical appearance of the sculptures by adopting a firmly formed frontal viewpoint, even though they would actually have been experienced on the move and from different angles. It is also worth noting how Sargent attempted to recreate the rich materiality of the original sculptures through the various relief elements. For instance, the metal swords are real, though perhaps not functional ones, just as they are in the original Spanish sculptures. Another source of inspiration for the Madonna of Sorrows may have come via Sargent's friend and fellow artist, his Spanish contemporary Joaquin Sorolla. A series of 3 letters in the Sorolla Museum in Madrid, uncovered by Richard Ormond, reveal that Sorolla lent Sargent a study of a Madonna from Valencia around 1908, and that Sargent thanked him, claiming to have found it useful. Now, it seems to me that by useful, he could only really have been referring to its relevance in the creation of his own Spanish Madonna for the Boston Public Library. The loaned study may correspond to this drawing of a statue in a village in the province of Valencia, which offers much more precision and detail than the much sketchier oil studies that Sargent made of such subjects. And I think there's certainly some resemblance between the crown in Sorolla's representation and the one that Sargent depicted in the Boston Library. Sargent evidently relished mixing iconography and mimicking the rich materials of the Spanish sources. However, His own Madonna of Sorrows lacked precisely what gave meaning to her Spanish counterparts, since she was emphatically not sorrowful. The iconography of the Seven Swords was intended as a bodily metaphor to help the spectator empathize more deeply with the Virgin's spiritual torture, which was already written on her face. After all, the original sculptures of the sorrowful virgins, like the one I'm showing you here, usually had facial expressions which showed their anguish. Realistic tears made of glass or resin often flowed down their faces, and when the sculptures were taken to the streets, it was common for spectators to respond with tears themselves. The lack of emotion in Sargent's Madonna of Sorrows disappointed George Santayana, the philosopher of Spanish origin who had initially been impressed by the artist's appreciation of Spanish religious sculpture when the men coincided on the 1895 Granada trip. After seeing a reproduction of the Boston panel in 1923, Santayana wrote in a letter, and I quote, "The face is quite empty and doll-like, and the hand seems to be pressing a bouquet flirtatiously, and not a broken heart. The faces of the good old Spanish ladies are very beautiful and tragic, a combination of the grand lady and the saint." The implication here is that Sargent's Madonna of Sorrows is not just emotionally cold, but is actually a kind of coquettish femme fatale figure. This idea calls to mind once again Baudelaire's subversive Madonna poem that we discussed earlier. But Sargent probably had another closer literary source in mind as well. Around 1889, his friend Vernon Lee had written a supernatural tale about a Spanish statue of the Madonna titled The Virgin of the Seven Daggers. The story is a synthesis of Lee's very negative impressions of Spanish Catholicism based on her own trip to Andalusia, combined with aspects of the Spanish myth of Don Juan. The tale basically centers on Don Juan's idolatry of a superficial, vain, and corrupt animated statue of the Virgin of the Seven Sorrows in a Granada church. In spite of his terrible sins, the Virgin idol rewards Don Juan with immortality for publicly defending her as the fairest woman in the world. Lee described the sculpture's rich appearance as follows, and I quote, "She stares steadfastly forth with a sad and ceremonious smile. Her head is crowned with a great jeweled crown. Her slippered feet rest on a crescent moon. In her bodice, a little clearing is made among the brocade and the seed pearl, and into this are stuck 7 gold-hilted knives." Now, it's striking how closely Sargent's Madonna of Sorrows matches this description, right down to the peculiar synthesis of the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception with the Virgin of the Seven Sorrows. But it's equally clear that Sargent, like Lee, also intended his Madonna to be cold and superficial, fitting with the mural cycle's general presentation of Catholicism as ritualistic and archaic, and reflecting a long-standing Protestant distaste for such imagery. There is a contrast between this cold Madonna and the more emotive representation of the crucified Christ in the Dogma of the Redemption, for instance. Moreover, just like the literary Madonnas of Baudelaire and Vernon Lee, Sargent's figure has an ambiguous status, since she has the face and hands of a person but the plinth of a sculpture. In relation to her pagan counterpart Astarte, the only other figure to stand on a plinth, the Madonna of Sorrows stands for the return of idolatry. Having explored Sargent's multiple sources for the Madonna of Sorrows, I now want to examine the process by which he arrived at this definitive design. At some point during the course of the preparation, he must have painted this watercolor, which has presented something of a puzzle to researchers. It is known by the descriptive title Virgin in Spain, which matches one hypothesis that it is an oil sketch of a real Spanish altarpiece, specifically an earlier composite that Sargent was trying out for the Madonna of Sorrows before settling on the definitive image. I say this firstly because the subject is very unusual. It's clearly a Madonna of the Seven Sorrows, But in Catholic iconography, this type of Madonna is always shown alone, whereas here she's surrounded by a host of other characters. These accompanying figures are presumably saints, dressed as nuns and monks, which are a common feature in Spanish processional sculptures, as are, of course, the candles. It seems likely, therefore, that Sargent combined various elements that appeared in his Spanish photographs to compose this image, before settling on a simpler composition in the final mural panel. It is true that the architectural framing in the watercolour does not match the corresponding space in the library hall, but there's a very plausible explanation for this. For several years after accepting the mural commission, Sargent was working from his studio in London with a small architectural model of the hall supplied to him by the chief architect of the building. The model is now lost, but we know from Sargent's letters that it contained inaccuracies in the positioning of the pilasters below the frieze. In fact, some of the pilasters were actually missing from the model. If Sargent believed he had more space than he actually did, and did not count on the first set of pilasters on either side of the space, this would explain why he might initially have extended the composition horizontally below the frieze. Sargent found the first architectural model inadequate for his purposes, so later on he gradually constructed his own more accurate 1/3 scale model, as Catherine Olivier has discussed in her article on the subject. The Boston Public Library has in its collection the preparatory panel that belongs to the 2nd scale model. And I'd like to thank Meg Weeks here for bringing this to my attention and for sharing this image with me. The panel we're talking about is situated here in the centre of the slide, and we can see that the perimeters of the space are much closer to the definitive ones, with the pilasters now in place, although we can see that they do not match up exactly. And here in this image, I've tried to line up the top of the pilasters so that you can see what I mean. My hypothesis that the watercolour is a preliminary design for the Madonna of Sorrows also makes sense if we consider the work as part of another pair, partnered with the Handmaid of the Lord. Here it's useful to take a step back and look again at the Catholic-themed south end of the hall to appreciate how the two renditions of Mary are placed opposite each other, occupying spaces of identical shape and size, and also to recognise that they're connected to each other by the mysteries of the Rosary arching across the vault. And if we look at these next 3 images, I suggest that we can see exactly the same process of refining and simplifying the design. Again, the sequence begins with a watercolour that lacks this first set of pilasters and has a large cast of characters. Once again, this is a watercolour that has been assumed to be an oil sketch of a real existing altarpiece, but which I'm suggesting is also a composite. The sequence continues with the more spatially accurate panel from Sargent's 1/3 scale model and ends with the definitive version. So to sum up my hypothesis and the 2 parallel processes for the Madonnas, here we can see the 2 watercolours corresponding to the early design when Sargent was working with the first model, the 2 in the middle corresponding to Sargent's second model, and on the right, the 2 definitive panels. Now, while the Madonna of Sorrows is a synthesis of Spanish sculptural sources, as we've seen, the Handmaid of the Lord is informed by Italian models. And this is particularly the case if we look at the earliest watercolour in the sequence. The subject of the enthroned Virgin with Child, accompanied by saints, was a popular subject among Italian Renaissance artists. It was Giovanni Bellini who pioneered this particular type of Sacra Conversazione. Like Bellini, Sargent initially placed St. Sebastian on the far right of the group and St. Francis on the far left. However, the motif of the flying angels crowning Mary, which survives into the definitive version, as you can see here, doesn't appear in any of the Renaissance examples that I've seen, and I suggest was probably taken from elsewhere. It's frequent, for example, in Northern European representations, such as this one by the Netherlandish painter Gerard David, which Sargent could have seen in the Prado Museum on one of his many Spanish trips. It's significant that Italian and Northern influences were behind the scene, which alludes to the birth of Christ and appears just under the joyful mysteries of the Rosary, while in contrast, the Spanish Madonna of Sorrows appeared just below the sorrowful mysteries. In setting up this contrast, Sargent was effectively perpetuating a stereotypical view of Spanish Catholicism as particularly somber and deathly. Indeed, the centerpiece of the Sorrowful Mysteries is a crucifixion inspired by one of El Greco's paintings in the Prado, as other researchers have already pointed out. Sargent revisited the character of Mary one last time in the mural scheme, in the personification of Church, installed in 1919. Church was intended to show the triumph of Christianity in Western religion, and it was paired with the highly controversial synagogue, which alluded to Judaism. At the same time, though, it was, of course, a pietà, with a Catholic rather than Protestant flavour. Notice the loose similarities in this case with some of the sculptures of the Deposition that can be found among Sargent's Spanish photographs. Church is a multi-layered image, and it lends itself to different, perhaps even conflicting interpretations. As I see it, though, the figure is not presented sympathetically. Staring straight ahead, this Mary is even more impervious than the Madonna of Sorrows. Her black-lined eyes and red mouth suggest once again a sinister and rigid femme fatale who looks oblivious to the vulnerable and very human dead Christ, who is sustained, almost trapped between her large thighs. In this final representation of Christianity in the murals, Sargent seems to be suggesting that Christ is a victim of the constraints of organized religion, and specifically of Catholicism. To conclude, it's clear that Sargent drew from a range of artistic and literary sources from Spain or about Spain to create his Madonna of Sorrows, and that photographs of sculpture helped him considerably throughout the process. He evidently conceived the mural scheme in terms of contrasted and paired characters, who together conveyed the project's meaning. Paired with Astarte, the Madonna of Sorrows symbolizes primitive idolatry, in which the boundary between sculpture and person is impossibly blurred. Paired with Christ, she is a rigid, ritualistic, vain and uncompromising icon who contrasts negatively with the humanity and humility of Jesus. And paired with the Handmaid of the Lord, she sums up Sargent's view of Spanish religious art. Sensual, sumptuous, but also sometimes metaphorically dark. As a kind of epilogue, I want to show you a final image. This painting, titled The Confession, which shows the interior of a small Catholic chapel in the Austrian Tyrol. Sargent became trapped in the region in 1914 due to the outbreak of World War I, and there began to develop a new interest in the contemporary practice of Catholic devotion, something that he had entirely ignored in his quest for iconographical models for the Boston Public Library. If we look very carefully, we can just make out a representation of a Virgin of the Seven Sorrows in this painting, but Sargent has cut almost all of it off at the left edge of the painting. We can conclude that this particular Marian icon that preoccupied him for decades apparently ceased to do so. In this painting, it's the crucifix and the act of confession that capture Sargent's interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chloe. I'm clapping in the background. I don't know if you can see.
Thank you.
And I know, looking at our webinar numbers this morning, that you have quite a few audience members out there who are probably doing the same. We really appreciate, as I said, your extensive research and for sharing that with us today in such an engaging fashion and complemented by such vibrant imagery. It's really fascinating to consider the imagery of the murals in light of their connections to photograph sculpture, as you've noted, and particularly to Sargent's own travels and experiences. It definitely expands the range of the reach of this installation in Boston to completely new worlds, and it makes this already complex work even richer. And I particularly appreciate your connection between the depictions of Madonna in the 1916 installations and that of a Sargent in 1895, so many years earlier. To see that consistency in his work where so many have noticed that he had evolved and changed is really exciting, and to make that connection is just a credit to you. So thank you for that. We look forward to seeing and reading further strides in your research, and particularly to the exhibition upcoming in Washington, DC, Sargent in Spain at the National Gallery later this year. So I hope those of you in attendance today will be able to visit the exhibition, and of course to take note of some of the online resources that the National Gallery is no doubt putting together. I have a few questions, Chloe, if we have about 8 minutes left, if you don't mind me passing those along. One comes from Jerry, who asks, was Sargent interested in the evolution of theology and religion outside of his research into art history and religious iconography? And you may have already answered that in terms of his potential literary references, but are you able to speak a bit further to his research beyond just that imagery that was depicted in art historical examples?
Well, obviously the Boston project occupies so much of his life that in a sense it's all those decades. I think he's thinking about the murals in the background of his mind the whole time. But he does do quite a lot of reading. I think it's quite impressive. For example, he reads some kind of visionary accounts, like I forget the name, a nun's visionary account of like the life of Jesus, basically, who she sort of saw the visions of in her vision, sorry, she reimagined the life of Christ, and he read this whole book and commented on it with his friends. And I think this is the kind of thing that maybe didn't find its way into the murals, but showed that he had this wider interest. And then the kind of this interest that I just hinted at the very end, this focus on the contemporary practice of Catholic devotion, also on the kind of haunting, deathly aspect connected with the First World War that he kind of develops when he's in the Austrian Tyrol, that I think Karen Corsano and Daniel Williman will probably discuss in their talk. I think they point to other interests, religious interests beyond the library preparation.
And their talk, I should mention too, Dan and Karen, their talk will be this next Monday, the 23rd of May. So more information about their upcoming talk and how to access that, as well as recordings of these and previous talks. That was another question in the chat. Will these recordings be recorded and made available? All of these talks will be posted online at bpl.org/Sargent, as well as in all likelihood to BPL's YouTube channel. So we will be sending out, or doing our best to send out, notification of those recordings to all of you who have registered and making those available. Thank you, Chloe, for that particular answer. I also have a question from our friend Erica, just across the neighborhood at the MFA. Erica asks or says that she's curious in how the negative aspects that you have drawn between Sargent's Catholic iconography might relate to the anti-Catholic immigration politics in Boston, and if you had any thoughts on that subject particularly.
I'm not very familiar with those particular politics in Boston. I think it fits with I would say, a general attitude in the West. It's also in Western Europe, and in fact, interestingly, it's also a Spanish attitude, because there was a generation of intellectuals and writers sort of at the very end of the 19th century who put forward this idea of Black Spain. Just to clarify, this has absolutely no connection to race and theory. It is the idea that Spain was kind of inherently obsessed with death. So the idea of Black being sort of mourning, being associated with kind of superstition, and how Catholicism was kind of a key part of this. So I would say that it's an attitude that's quite wide, and like I said, actually very common among Sargent's own contemporaries in Spain. And Sorolla, who I mentioned in the talk, actually presents a kind of opposite view. I think Mary Elizabeth Boone has discussed this in her book, But basically, in Spain at this time, you've got these sort of two, I guess, ways of painting. Some artists very much focusing on this Black Spain narrative, and Sargent went to Spain often enough to actually have also caught on, I think, to the spirit of this kind of representation of Spain as being archaic and darkly Catholic. At the same time as also having a lot in common with Sorolla, who was doing the opposite. Yeah, I don't know if that's answered the question.
No, it's a complex
topic.
And you've definitely, I think, broadened it far beyond the world of Boston, which again, in light of making international connections, not only with today's talk, but with the scholarship around these murals that are so site specific here in our city, we're really seeing the extensions and the themes, not only in the murals, but in the attitudes towards Catholicism extend far beyond the community of Boston. Thank you, Erica, for that fascinating question. And hello from your neighbors at BPL, and thank you, Chloe. I do have a note here, presumably from someone involved in the exhibition, who notes the exhibition Sargent in Spain will travel to the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco from February to May of 2023, following them being on view, the exhibition being on view in Washington, DC from October of this year to January of next. So thank you for making that note to our guest. Chloe, I think you have a lot of friends and colleagues in the audience today. I have a quick question before I'll sort of close our remarks and tee up our upcoming lectures. And that is if you could speak a little bit more to your experience, Chloe, as your experience as a researcher in matching up Sargent's reference imagery to the correspondence between the artist and his peers that suggested what experiences he may have had and what he may have seen or experienced, if not documented or pulled reference photography from in Spain. And of course, many of us here have read your fascinating article on this subject, but did you have a sense before seeing the photographs at the Victoria and Albert Museum that his travels in Spain may have spurred some direct links between specific sculptural imagery and processions? Or did the discoveries in his correspondence, for instance, the letter that Richard had shared from Sorolla, or to Sorolla, I should say, did you have a sense that was that correspondence being discovered at the same time as the photographs were, or were those discoveries sort of building up in a particular order for you?
Well, actually, my starting point was the photographs. And that's really what led me to looking into the murals in the first place. So that kind of works backwards in that sense. I was on a project to research the Sargent's photographs, but specifically the ones on Spanish sculpture, because that's an area that I've researched before. So I went to the V&A and started cataloguing them, and then it's when I sort of started looking at Sargent's murals in more detail that I really saw a lot of connections there, and that was kind of the starting point.
It's fascinating, again, making the connections using sort of this, we talk a lot, and I say this as a museum person who's been working in a library for almost 10 years, the different modes of cataloging and distributing objects amongst collections or classifying them, and the fact that we can have a singular collection that says so much about the artist's reference material that for so long had been redistributed between collections because of their classification or the nature of their classification. So it's a really interesting, I think, insight that you provide into the work of institutions and researchers of those institutions, and how there are so many more discoveries likely to be made, not only for Sargent, but I'm sure many other mural installations in our cities and across the world. So thank you. I will close today, and actually Sarah Cash, the National Gallery of Art's curator of the show, is the person who graciously mentioned that connection. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us today. We're so excited to see the show. I will close by again saying thank you, Chloe, and thank you, Richard, if you're still with us. It's just such a privilege to be able to connect with researchers like yourselves, and to again do this work together to broaden the interpretations of Sargent between countries, between collections, and then to connect all of us who are invested in and love this material, and to make this material accessible to the public, to build out that story of these murals. So we're grateful to you for your research. And I should mention that we, as I said, our upcoming talk with Dan and Karen will air on Monday, the 23rd. And we have also just solidified our date for a panel discussion, also online, about the synagogue controversy following the installation of Sargent Synagogue in 1919. That will be an open format panel discussion between 3 speakers, myself moderating. The 3 speakers will be Rabbi Bernard Melman, scholar Elena Hoffenberg, and Massachusetts State Senator Mike Rush. It should be a really fascinating discussion, and we hope as many of you as possible will be able to join us. That is also at 11 a.m. Eastern time, so appropriate for our international viewers, we hope. Chloe, again, thank you. It was a wonderful, fascinating talk, and we can't wait to see more, the more that you do with your research. We're excited to see where you go next.
Thank you so much, Meg.
All right, have a lovely day, everyone, and we'll hopefully see you all soon. Take care.
Thank you.